Tom Harper never imagined his search for companionship would bring him here, standing alone on a narrow road in Bulacan long after the sun had vanished behind the distant rice fields, his hands shaking so badly that the cracked phone in his palm kept slipping against his sweat. He had flown more than 6,000 miles to meet the woman who spoke to him for months, the woman from Luzon, who sent gentle messages late at night, the woman who said she cared for him in ways he had not felt since his wife passed years earlier. He had pictured a warm embrace, a quiet smile, the simple comfort of a familiar voice finally becoming real. But the moment he stepped off that motorbike and saw the abandoned property ahead of him, he felt something inside his chest tighten, with a pressure he couldn't explain. He whispered her name into the wind, hoping for an answer, hoping for anything at all. But only the distant hum of insects came back to him. A locked metal gate stood between him and the place she told him to meet her. He thought he saw a woman's silhouette shift near the doorway, and for a second he felt relief until she turned away. Disappearing before he could speak, he called out, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Hello? Is anyone here?" What followed was a rush of sounds that didn't fit together. Hurried footsteps brushing against dry soil, a car door slamming somewhere out of sight, and a scream so sharp it split the night before, cutting off as if someone had pressed a hand over it. Tom froze in place, his breath stuck halfway in his lungs, and every promise she had ever made to him replayed in his mind in a way that suddenly felt unfamiliar, almost distant, almost like pieces of a story he never fully understood. Only one person knew what happened in the moments that followed, and she chose silence over explanation, leaving a trail of questions that no one, not Tom, not the neighbors, not the people who later searched this place, could answer with certainty. And now you're here, listening to the footsteps of a man who came to Luzon with hope in his heart, and found himself facing something he could not make sense of. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened next in Bulacan is more unbelievable than anything Tom expected. Stay with us as we step back from that quiet stretch of land in Bulacan where Tom Harper found himself trembling under the weight of questions he never planned to ask. We need to understand what brought a gentle, soft-spoken technician from Sacramento all the way to Luzon in the first place. Who exactly was the woman he followed across the ocean? The woman who spoke to him every night as if she knew the cracks in his voice better than anyone around him? Why did she tell him to avoid crowded places and insist he travel to a remote property instead of meeting in a public setting like most people would? And what could have pushed a man like Tom, steady, cautious, predictable in his routines, to run for safety in the middle of a foreign province where he barely understood the language or the roads? These questions shaped every mile he traveled and every message she sent, forming a trail that looked simple at first but grew more complicated with each step he took. Because when you look at the messages she sent him, the way she described her life, the way she said she felt unsafe yet hopeful, there are details that don't connect the way you'd expect. There are moments where her words seem honest, and others where they raise doubts Tom didn't want to accept. And now we are left with three questions that lie at the center of everything. Who was she? Why Bulacan? What was waiting for him there on that quiet night when everything changed? They're questions that seem straightforward on the surface but unravel into something much more personal once you understand Tom's heart, his loneliness, and the reason he trusted her so deeply. To make sense of this night, to understand how Tom ended up standing in front of an abandoned property clutching a damaged phone, we need to go back 6 months back to the moment his life shifted without him realizing it. Tom Harper was the kind of man people often overlooked, not because he lacked presence, but because he lived a quiet life that never demanded attention. At 52, he had settled into a predictable rhythm inside his small Sacramento home, where the walls still held framed photographs of a life he once shared with his late wife. His days were shaped by work at a nearby technical repair shop, evenings in his garage tinkering with old tools, and nights spent sitting on his back porch listening to the distant sound of passing traffic. Tom wasn't searching for excitement or change. If anything, he valued simplicity. He had never stepped outside the United States. He rarely took time off. He avoided trouble instinctively and carried himself with the gentle, straightforward honesty of someone who believed people were mostly good. But beneath all of that steadiness rested something deeper, a loneliness he didn't talk about, a longing to hear another voice at the end of the day, someone who would ask how he was and genuinely care about the answer. He wasn't looking for adventure. He wasn't looking for risk. He just wanted someone to talk to. That was when he met her, Maria Elena Cruz. She appeared in his life as a soft presence, typing messages with a warmth Tom had not felt in years. She told him she was from Luzon, living in a modest home with a small shop nearby, caring for her mother who often needed attention and rest. Maria Elena spoke gently, choosing her words with a kindness that felt intentional, almost soothing. She shared dreams of a peaceful life, a small garden, quiet mornings, and the belief that people could find meaning through compassion. She admired American values, admired Tom's work ethic, admired the way he listened to her without judgment, and slowly Tom found himself waiting for her messages, replaying her voice in his mind even though they had never spoken through a call. She made him feel noticed in a way that felt rare, a way he didn't know he needed until it was there. The conversation stretched late into the night, long paragraphs about her day. Stories about the customers who visited her shop. Memories of her mother singing to her as a child, and her hopes of meeting someone who valued sincerity above everything else. Tom responded with details from his own quiet life in Sacramento, telling her about the garage he was fixing up, the old radio he kept trying to repair, and the moments he missed having someone to share dinner with. Day after day, their messages wove a connection that felt almost natural, almost inevitable. And yet, there were small things, tiny gaps in her story, that surfaced but never stayed long enough to trouble him. She never joined a video call, always saying the network in her area made it difficult. She avoided talking about relatives beyond her mother. She kept her surroundings vague, offering glimpses but never specifics. To anyone watching from the outside, these might have been warnings, but to Tom, they were details he brushed aside because every message from Maria Elena felt sincere. Then came the moment that would change everything. One night, as Tom sat in his garage, surrounded by half-finished repairs and scattered tools, Maria Elena typed something she had never mentioned before. She said she wanted to meet him. She said she trusted him. She said she felt safer with him than with anyone else in her life. But she insisted on something unusual. "Please don't come to Manila," she wrote. "It's too crowded, and it won't be safe for me to meet you there. Can you meet me in Bulacan instead? It's quieter, more private. I'll feel safer." The message wasn't alarming to Tom. He had no frame of reference for the Philippines, no understanding of provincial borders or distances, so he simply accepted her suggestion. He told her he would consider it. He told her he wanted to see her too, and even through the screen, he felt her excitement. But what Tom didn't know, what he could not have imagined, was that someone else was reading every message he sent. Someone else was watching every moment of their growing connection, studying each word, each story, each hope he shared. And that unseen presence was waiting, quietly, silently, in the background of every conversation, shaping a path that would eventually take Tom thousands of miles from home and place him in the center of a night he would never forget. The truth behind this shadow would reveal itself later, but the first signs of it were already there, hidden between the lines of messages Tom believed were meant only for him. Tom Harper spent weeks thinking about Maria Elena's invitation, replaying every message she had ever sent, and imagining what it would feel like to finally stand in front of the woman who had slowly become the center of his daily life. The decision didn't come all at once. It built gradually, like a quiet pull he couldn't ignore. One morning, after a night of restless thoughts, he opened his laptop, typed in "flights to Manila," and stared at the search results, as if the screen itself were asking him a question. He bought the ticket without telling his family, because he didn't have much family left, and only mentioned the trip to a coworker he trusted, describing it vaguely as a vacation he had been postponing for too long. As the departure date approached, he packed slowly and methodically, folding shirts, sliding documents into an envelope, checking and rechecking his passport. There was excitement, yes, but beneath it was something quieter, an uneasiness he brushed aside each time it surfaced. He believed he was doing something hopeful, something worth taking a chance on. In the days leading up to his departure, Maria Elena grew more attentive, sending him long messages filled with gratitude and anticipation, but also instructions that puzzled him. She told him not to mention her name at the airport and not to tell immigration he was meeting anyone. She said it would complicate things, that some visitors preferred to say they were just sightseeing. She reminded him not to take regular taxis, explaining that they could be unsafe, and she insisted he turn off certain apps on his phone, ones that tracked location or stored personal details. Tom didn't understand why any of this was necessary, but he trusted her judgment. She also told him not to meet her in Manila, saying the city was overwhelming and that she would feel more comfortable in Bulacan, near an old property outside town where it was quieter. Each instruction raised another question in Tom's mind, yet he convinced himself that she was simply being cautious, that this was her environment, her home, and she knew what was best. She said it was safer that way, and he believed her. When Tom walked off the plane and stepped into the arrival hall in Manila, he felt the world shift around him. The air was warm and heavy, filled with unfamiliar sounds, overlapping voices, and a sense of movement in every direction. People rushed past with suitcases, drivers held signs above their heads, and conversations echoed through the terminal. Tom tried to steady himself, gripping his bag and searching for a familiar face even though he knew Maria Elena wouldn't be there. He checked his phone, expecting to see a message telling him where to go. But instead, he found a single line from her that made his stomach tighten. "I cannot meet you at the airport," she wrote. "Someone is watching me. Please go straight to Bulacan. I will explain later." Tom stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something shift inside him, not panic, but a sudden uncertainty he hadn't felt before. It was the first moment in his journey when something felt truly wrong. But he pushed the feeling aside because turning back felt impossible. Outside the airport, he stood on the curb, surrounded by noise and movement, trying to figure out what to do next. A man approached him quietly, mentioning Maria Elena's name and saying she had sent him. The man spoke politely, asking Tom to follow him to a vehicle parked a short walk away. Tom hesitated, glancing down at his phone, hoping for another message from Maria Elena that would make everything clearer. None came. He took a slow breath, looked around at the unfamiliar streets, and told himself that this was all part of the plan she had explained. He stepped into the unmarked vehicle, settling into the back seat as the door shut beside him with a firm thud. As the car pulled away from the airport and merged into traffic, Tom watched the city blur past the window, towering billboards, busy roads, unfamiliar neighborhoods, each passing moment carrying him farther from the world he understood. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late to turn back. Back in California, Tom's coworker, a man named Daniel Reed, grew uneasy when the weekend passed without a single update. Tom was usually predictable when he traveled, sending a picture from the airport, a quick message from his hotel, or even a simple thumbs up to show he'd arrived safely. But this time there was nothing. Daniel sent a couple of texts, then tried calling, but every attempt went straight to voicemail. At first, he convinced himself Tom was simply exhausted from the long flight, but as the hours stretched into a full day, a heavy concern pushed its way into his thoughts. He remembered how Tom had described the trip, vague details about meeting a friend, instructions from someone he had never met face to face, and an uncomfortable feeling he'd admitted only once before leaving. Daniel began searching through old conversations, trying to find clues about where Tom had gone or who he was meeting, unaware that at that same moment, Tom was being driven down long, unfamiliar roads in Bulacan, far removed from the safe and ordinary life he had left behind. As the driver took Tom deeper into rural Bulacan, the scenery gradually changed from busy streets to quieter villages, small houses, and long stretches of farmland. The farther they drove, the more Tom felt the weight of isolation settle over him. The driver offered no conversation, only glancing at Tom through the rearview mirror from time to time with an unreadable expression. When they finally turned onto a narrow road leading to a cluster of old structures, Tom felt a tightness in his chest. The property Maria Elena had described as her family's place looked abandoned, paint peeling, grass uncut, a metal gate rusted at the hinges. The driver motioned for him to get out. Tom stepped forward cautiously, gripping his bag as he approached the front of the house. He heard faint voices inside, but none of them sounded like the soft, gentle voice he had come to know through messages. When a figure appeared in the dim light of the doorway, it was a woman. Yes, but not the woman from the photos. Tom froze, confusion washing over him. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The woman stared at him with a look that wasn't welcoming. It was studying him, evaluating him, as if she already knew more about Tom than he knew about her. She didn't introduce herself or explain why he had been brought there. Behind her, more voices murmured, and Tom could hear the shuffle of footsteps, the type that made him feel less like a guest and more like an unexpected visitor. He called out Maria Elena's name, his voice trembling slightly, hoping she would step out from behind the door or appear from another room. Instead, the woman simply said, "No Maria here." In a calm but distant tone, Tom's heart raced. He checked his phone again, but he had no signal. The messages he had exchanged with Maria Elena began replaying in his mind, and he wondered for the first time whether any part of her story had been real. Tom wasn't welcomed, the truth would later reveal. He was observed. When investigators eventually reviewed the case, they discovered details that didn't make sense. The messages Tom received over the months didn't match the writing style of the woman whose name he knew. Authorities found that the profile photos Maria Elena used belonged to a nurse living in another part of Bulacan who had no idea her images were circulating online. The name, age, and location Maria had given Tom were inconsistent with several other details uncovered during the investigation. It became clear the identity he thought he trusted had layers he never questioned. Filipino authorities recognized the property from previous reports involving unrelated concerns, and locals later described hearing raised voices the night Tom arrived. One person said they heard someone speaking English, another mentioned hearing running outside shortly before midnight. Each account added to the confusion, painting a picture of a situation far more complicated than a simple misunderstanding. Investigators also encountered conflicting statements from people in the area. A neighbor insisted she had seen a woman matching Maria Elena's description around the property days before Tom arrived, but another resident claimed Maria had never lived there at all. A man working nearby told authorities that he saw Tom walking around the property looking lost, but he described Tom as acting suspicious, raising questions about his own reliability as a witness. Every detail seemed to conflict with another, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. The chat logs, the blurred profile photos, the sudden instructions to avoid certain places, none of it fit together cleanly. What they did know was that Tom had been led to a place that didn't match the story he had been told, and someone in that house seemed to know exactly who Tom was, long before he ever stepped foot on the property. But they weren't expecting what he brought with him. In the weeks following Tom Harper's disappearance, investigators dug deeper into the digital trail he left behind, trying to understand who Maria Elena Cruz really was. What they uncovered would become the first major turning point of the case. The messages Tom had received didn't carry the writing style of a single person. They varied in tone, rhythm, and the use of certain phrases. Some were warm and affectionate, while others were sharp and unusually formal. The voice notes Tom kept saved on his phone had different background sounds and slightly different accents. Even the photos sent to him came from inconsistent angles, lighting, and locations that didn't match one another. After tracing the online activity and comparing timestamps, authorities discovered a truth Tom never realized. Maria Elena Cruz wasn't one person at all. It was three separate individuals sharing one identity, each contributing to a single persona he believed was real. One wrote the messages, one supplied the photos, and one recorded the soft, caring voice notes that made him trust her completely. They didn't want his money. They wanted him to come to Bulacan. Investigators began forming the first shape of a motive, but even then, it wasn't clear. Whoever controlled the Maria Elena persona had put significant effort into building Tom's trust. They mapped out his routines, learned his emotional vulnerabilities, and understood his need for companionship. It wasn't random. It wasn't casual. It was planned. Authorities found conversations discussing Tom's widowed status, his financial limits, and his loneliness. But they noticed something important. There were no requests for bank transfers, expensive items, or financial favors. There was nothing tying the communication to a traditional scam. That detail haunted the investigators. If money wasn't the reason he was lured thousands of miles away, then what was waiting for him at that abandoned property? What purpose did meeting him in person serve? As they followed the clues, the story began to shift into something far more troubling than an online deception. Something that suggested Tom had been deliberately drawn to a place where someone already knew his exact steps, his habits, and the moment he would arrive. Inside that old property in Bulacan, Tom felt the uneasiness growing with each passing minute. The woman in the doorway still hadn't explained anything. She didn't step forward. She didn't step backward. She watched him closely, as if waiting for him to make a move. Tom called Maria Elena's name again, louder this time, hoping he had simply misunderstood what she meant in her messages. The woman shook her head slightly, repeating once more, No Maria here. But just as Tom tried to make sense of the situation, he heard a sound from further inside the house. It wasn't the voice of a woman. It was a man, calm at first, speaking in a low tone, as though giving instructions to someone. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The messages he had received for months had never hinted at another person being involved. The presence of a man in the house didn't match anything he had been told. Something inside him whispered that the truth was starting to break through, piece by piece. The man's voice grew louder, the tone shifting as if he had been interrupted. Tom stepped back instinctively, unsure whether to run or to wait for an explanation. Then it happened, a moment so quiet yet so overwhelming that it carved itself into his memory. As Tom stood in the shadow of the doorway, trying to look inside, he heard something unmistakable. Someone whispered his name. Soft, almost gentle, as if testing whether he could hear it. His breath caught. The whisper came from deeper inside the house, close enough to recognize the pronunciation, far enough to blur the source. It wasn't the woman at the door. It wasn't the man he had heard talking. It was someone else. Someone who already knew him, knew his name, and knew he was standing there alone. The door creaked slowly, as if someone inside had nudged it further open. Tom froze. His heart pounded so loudly he could feel it in his fingertips. And in that still moment between fear and realization, he sensed that everything he believed about Maria Elena was on the edge of falling apart. As investigators pieced the story together, they reached a truth that was far more heartbreaking than any theory they initially considered. The identity Tom knew as Maria Elena Cruz did exist, but the real woman behind that name was not the person in the photos he had grown attached to. She was not the confident, smiling figure posed in well-lit pictures, or the gentle voice that soothed him through the loneliness of quiet evenings. The real Maria Elena was a quiet, frightened young woman who lived under the authority of relatives who dictated almost every aspect of her life. These relatives had created the online persona, weaving together images from someone else's profile and voice notes from another person to build a believable identity. For months, Maria had been used as the face of a plan she never wanted to be part of. A plan targeting men like Tom, people longing for companionship, people who trusted too easily, people who never suspected the person they cared for wasn't free. The intention behind the setup was not what Tom had feared at first. Investigators found no evidence of violence planned against him. Instead, the relatives controlling Maria had developed a method of isolating their targets. They would convince foreigners to travel, bring them to a secluded location, and then pressure them for money, usually through emotional manipulation, guilt, or threats of reporting them for fabricated offenses. It was a coercive operation, calculated and rehearsed. Tom had been selected because he was gentle, open-hearted, and grieving the loss of his wife. He responded to kindness quickly. He trusted people easily. And in their view, that made him someone they could influence. But buried beneath the layers of deception, something unexpected had grown. Maria had developed real concern for Tom. She didn't want to see him trapped or controlled the same way she had been for years. On the night Tom arrived at the abandoned property, the truth of everything became visible in the smallest of moments. The silhouette he'd seen, the figure who turned away as soon as he stepped onto the porch, was Maria herself. She had quietly stepped outside in a desperate attempt to warn him. She wasn't allowed to speak openly. She wasn't allowed to communicate without supervision. But she had followed the movement of the unmarked vehicle and waited at the door, hoping he would see the fear in her eyes. When he didn't understand, when the driver ushered him closer, she slipped back inside, whispering urgently to someone in the shadows. And when the cousins moved further toward the back room, Maria leaned just close enough to whisper his name through the crack in the door, not to welcome him, but to tell him the truth in the only way she could. She was trying to say one word: run. Tom didn't fully understand the warning at first. But when he heard her voice, soft, trembling, almost swallowed by the darkness, something inside him pushed him to turn away. He stepped back, his hand shaking as he fumbled with his bag. And when he heard footsteps rushing toward the doorway, he bolted. He ran through the side of the property, his foot catching on uneven ground, sending him tumbling and injuring his leg. He struggled to stand, pain shooting up his leg, but the fear driving him forward was stronger. Limping, breathless, heart pounding, he pushed himself toward the road, calling out for help as he waved at the first light he saw. His voice echoed through the quiet night, and one of the neighbors, already uneasy after hearing earlier noises, Made a call to local authorities. There's a foreigner screaming outside, the neighbor said, frightened by the sudden chaos. Within minutes, officers were on their way. By the time authorities reached the area, the cousins who had controlled the Maria Elena persona had already fled toward the back fields, disappearing before the officers could identify them. The house fell silent, leaving only scattered traces of what had taken place inside. But the most striking disappearance was Maria herself. When officers searched the rooms, she was nowhere to be found. A neighbor reported seeing a young woman slipping away from the property, covering her face with a scarf as she hurried down a side street. Though officers attempted to locate her, she refused to speak to them, too afraid of what her relatives might do if she cooperated. She vanished before sunrise, becoming as elusive in real life as the identity that had been built around her online. And the woman who had risked everything to save Tom Harper, who whispered his name to protect him, disappeared into the night as quietly as she had lived. Tom returned to the United States, shaken, exhausted, and forever changed. He carried the emotional weight of everything he had experienced, the moments of fear, the confusion, the unsettling realization that the person he believed cared for him had been trapped in a world he never understood. Yet despite the pain, he also carried a deep sense of sympathy for Maria, the real woman whose life had been shaped by fear and control. He tried to move forward, telling himself the story ended in Bulacan, that the chapter was closed. But 1 month after returning home, as he sat alone in his kitchen sorting through mail, his phone buzzed with a message. A simple, heartbreaking line appeared on the screen. "I'm sorry. Please forget me. M." Tom stared at the message for a long time, unable to tell whether it came from the woman who protected him that night, or from the people who once controlled her identity. In the end, Tom Harper walked away from Bulacan with more than fear. He walked away with questions that still echo through the quiet corners of his mind. Questions about identity, trust, and the people we choose to believe when we feel alone. He left with the memory of a face he never truly saw, a voice he heard only once through a cracked door, and a message that arrived long after the nights in Bulacan stopped haunting him. "I'm sorry. Please forget me." Those were the final words he ever received from the name he once knew as Maria Elena Cruz. But her fate remains silent. She drifted through his life like a shadow close enough to touch, yet never fully seen, never fully free. Tom survived Bulacan. But Maria, the real Maria, the young woman who whispered his name not to welcome him, but to save him, her path is still hidden. Some say she left the province entirely. Others believe she returned to the same quiet routines, living under the same watchful eyes she once tried to escape. And there are those who believe she reached out to Tom one last time not to apologize, but to protect him from something she couldn't explain. So let me ask you, what do you think really happened that night? Was Maria Elena a victim caught inside a web she never chose? Or was she part of something larger, something layered, something we may never fully understand? Your thoughts matter more than you know. And if this story held your attention, if it made you think twice about trust, about online connections, about the fragile line between hope and danger, then don't stop here. There's another story waiting for you, another real-life mystery just as emotional, just as unexpected, and just as powerful. It's on your screen right now, ready when you are. Before you go, don't forget to like this video if Tom and Maria's journey moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this warning. And subscribe, because every week, we bring you real-life stories filled with unanswered questions, shocking twists, and human moments you'll never forget. Thank you for watching, and stay safe out there. Until next time.